Hello and welcome to the FatBoss guide to the Twin Ogron encounter on Mythic in Highmaul.
Yes, and this fight is one of the more easy fights, really. Strange considering it is like the 5th boss in the instance. This is actually the 2nd boss you really want to progress on. Once you kill Kargath, you can go straight to Twin Ogron, and really, it is pretty simple because the gear requirement is like relatively low in comparison to all the other bosses.
There's no real high HPS or DPS requirements. Really, just to defeat the encounter is just knowing about the mechanics and not dying.
Yeah,
and the boss will eventually die himself, so... But before we talk about all the mechanics, if you do not know this fight at all, it will save us some time if you go watch the normal mode guide, because we are only going to cover the mythic changes. So go click up on the annotation, that'll take you to our normal and heroic guide, so you can learn all of that. And for this encounter, you do want to bring 2 tanks, 4 healers or so, and then a mixture of ranged and melee DPS.
So as we said before, the fight has remained pretty much the same. The bosses still do the same abilities at the certain energy intervals, and you still deal with them in the same way. So like the Enfeebling Roar, you stack up, stop casting and interrupting shout, all that kind of shit is the exact same. However, a couple new mechanics have been introduced. Now the bosses take turns at becoming Arcane empowered. This will change the way their 33% energy ability works, as well as it increases the amount of damage they deal to the tanks as well. It's not a huge amount, but healers, you might want to just note which boss is empowered and which tank is tanking it.
So just like on Heroic and Normal, when Pole does reach his 33% energy mark, he will cast Shield Charge. Now when this ability is empowered, just before he actually starts to charge, he'll summon 3 copies that spawn around him, and they'll always go off in the direction of him from his left to his right and behind him. However, these mobs won't charge out until he has finished his charge, which means that everyone kind of needs to avoid all of them. The copies that do spawn, if you do get hit by them, they work exactly the same way as Pole's charge. You'll take the same amount of damage and you'll still get the debuff. And if you're stood quite far away, the shield charge on Mythic can easily one-hit you because the damage, of course, as you'd expect, has been increased. So all you need to do with these when you do get these 3 copies is literally just avoid them. They're super easy to avoid. All you need to do is just focus on where the boss is charging and just sidestep his one. If you sidestep his charge, you won't get hit by any of the other ones at all. One thing to note with this charge though, it can be a little bit iffy for melee, so you do want to move to maximum melee range when these extra mobs spawn, just so you definitely avoid their charge.
Now, FATBOSS's 33% energy ability is Whirlwind, you know, where he spins around and he hurts the tank and makes sure you're not standing near it. Very, very simple. However, when this is empowered, it will drag all players across the entire room towards it. Now, this is relatively easy to, counter. You just run away from him at this point. You can use things like Aspects of the Fox and all that kind of stuff just so you can keep up damage and healing. But all you need to do is run away from him. And this isn't really an issue by itself. It's mainly when it's comboed with other abilities, which we'll cover when we get to them.
So on top of those 2 changes, there is actually one new ability that has been added to the fight, and that is an ability called Arcane Volatility. Now this is a debuff that is applied to 3 players, but it doesn't do anything at all until the debuff expires. Like the trash, this debuff, when it does expire, it will do AoE damage around you. So you need to make sure that you're spread within 8 yards when this debuff does finally expire.
Now the way the debuffs come in is that there's pretty much 3 sets of debuffs that come out. So one wave goes out, hits 3 players, and another wave goes out, hit 3 players, and once again one more wave comes out and hits 3 players, and then it will happen again every minute or so this happens. So really the debuff is very easy to counter. However, once again, it's when this is comboed with horrible things like Enfeebling Roar and stuff like that that you really need to be careful about it.
So they are literally the only changes and the things that have been added to the encounter. Everything else remains the same, including the timing of abilities when they overlap. However, just like in Heroic and Normal, the only difficult parts of this encounter are the moments when they do overlap, and with these new changes, there's a couple more things that you should really know in order just so you can get the bosses down a lot easier.
So at the start of the fight, we drag the bosses over to one side of the room. We kind of sit in a nice little corner area. Now the reason that we do this is that it actually helps out with the fires, because you only get half of the fires really moving towards you rather than all of them if you were standing in the middle. This does mean that every now and then you'll get a horrible fire that you really need to move a lot from, but most of the time you can pretty much stand still or just move a very small amount, and you don't need to move as often, which is really nice. And also this keeps everyone in the same area roughly, which makes it so you know where the shield charge is going to go, so that makes it very easy to avoid that, as well as it makes it so you can heal everyone, because there's quite a lot of damage going out at points.
Now the first empower that comes in the fight will always be on the Whirlwind, and when this does come in, the tank that is on that boss needs to just drag the boss into the middle of the room, and at this point you will have fires floating around the room, and that's what kind of makes this overlap a little bit difficult, because you are being dragged towards the boss, and if there's a fire between you and the boss and you don't have a speed increase, it can be very difficult for you to avoid it. But ultimately, if you just use your speed increases, or if you communicate with the rest of the raid when you do need a speed increase, it's absolutely fine. In this fight, if you get 1 fire stack on Mythic, it's not a big deal. 2 hurts a lot. 3 or more is really bad. healers need to spot heal the shit out of you. So if you do need to move through a fire because of this ability, run straight through it. Just completely run straight through it and don't get hit by it anymore.
Now, shortly after this, when the Enfeebling Roar is about to come in, the first set of Arcane Volatility debuffs happen at the same time. And now you're thinking, hold on, I need to be spread away from everyone by 8 yards, but I also need to get the Enfeebling Roar, and it's a right pain in the ass. So the way that you deal with this is that everyone who doesn't have the debuff, you are literally inside the boss's hitbox. Pulverize isn't coming in for a little while, so you're absolutely fine to be completely stacked on top of one another. And then you have the 3 players with the Arcane Volatility debuff be within 20 yards of the boss while being 8 yards away from everyone else. This means that everyone will get the debuff, so the debuff will be spread across everyone, reducing the amount of damage it will be taking, because a Pulverize is about to come in, and then a Quake's about to come in. So if the debuff is horribly spread, then you're going to have a really hard time healing that up.
But ultimately, if you're struggling at this point, if you do have the debuff, don't even bother going underneath the boss. But ultimately, if you can make it so everyone gets hit by the Enfeebling Roar as much as possible, it helps you a lot. Now, shortly after this, you will have a Pulverize go off, and then you'll have a Quake. And at these sort of combinations of Quake plus something else that does AoE damage to the raid, we usually use a large healing cooldown. So we'll use the Tranks, the Healing Tide Totems, the Hymns. We usually save Foxes for this moment as well, because, especially for the channeled ones such as the Hymns and the Tranks, because they need to move, and if they're stood still, it's likely they'll get hit by the fire. And they also have to move from shield charges occasionally at these points, at these crossover points. So when you do use these cooldowns, do use Foxes. It helps them a shit ton. If not, they just have to position really, really well and make sure they're not near the raid.
Now, just like in normal mode, you'll once again get an Enfeebling Roar and a Pulverized crossover point, and you know how to do this. You just make sure you're all under the boss, but spread out 3 yards. But the boss is a bastard, and it's just like, yeah, have some Arcane Volatility debuffs as well. So it's pretty vicious. However, it seems that the Arcane Volatility debuffs happen maybe 1 or 2 seconds after the Enfeebling Roar goes out. So if you can stay in and then blink out with the Enfeebling Roar afterwards, that way you'll make it very, very simple. But once again, this is probably one of the more iffy ones, because like a lot of things are happening in a very, very small area. If you do have the debuff and you're like unsure whether or not you can take it safely, just stay out of the group, and otherwise just make sure you spread 4 yards underneath the boss while still be within 20 yards of FATBOSS.
Now, the last sort of awkward moment that you could potentially get while you're on this fight is when you have the point where the Empowered Whirlwind, that's the whirlwind that's dragging you towards that particular boss, and a Pulverize hit at the exact same time. Now, really, this isn't a massive deal, but it can be slightly problematic for melee occasionally. As you guys are getting dragged in, you are being pulled to a single point. If you just stand there and don't do anything about it, you're eventually going to stack. And you don't want to stack because this Pulverize is just going to annihilate you. So that's something more for melee to keep in mind.
It's really better at this point, just even if you are a melee, just stop dealing damage and just run away from the boss if you're worried, because it's better that you stay alive rather than you do an extra bit of damage.
The enrage timer on this boss is not tight by any means. No. Literally, the whole encounter is just don't die, don't take stupid risks, don't stand the fire, and if you do have to go through a fire because you have no other option, make sure you run straight through it so you only get a single stack. And really, it's just all about these awkward crossover points, just like it was on Heroic. But providing you deal with them and you progress the fight slowly, applying these tactics to each crossover point, you shouldn't have any issues with this boss and you should kill it relatively quickly.
So thank you very much for watching, guys. If this video did help you out, then make sure you do leave us a like. It helps us out a lot. And if you'd like to see any of our other Mythic Highmaul guides, then make sure you do click up on the annotations you see on your screen now, and it'll take you straight to those videos.
Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.